This is the AMP Business Podcast, a weekly show featuring the top leaders, innovators, and hustlers that are making it happen in Northern California. Here's your host, Chad Alderson.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the AMP Business Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Alderson. With me today is Laura Cootsona with the Jesus Center. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chad. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming. It's been, we trying to, schedule. I backed out on you once, you backed out on me once, and we finally figured it out. So thanks for coming on and making the time. So you just got out of done with a vacation, yeah?
I had a few days up in Lake Tahoe, which is
Nice.
always a place of respite.
Did you guys go North Shore or South Shore?
North Shore.
Nice. Yeah, I prefer North these days. But when I was in my 20s, not so much. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, it's definitely quiet and family oriented.
Yeah, your compass flips when you get older, it seems like. Well, let's talk about your background. Obviously, you head up the Jesus Center, or director?
Executive director.
Executive director of the Jesus Center.
Yeah.
Before we kind of get into the Jesus Center, give me some background and, in terms of like where you grew up.
Yeah, so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and headed to Berkeley for my college years. In those days, in the 80s, there was already a huge problem with homelessness in Berkeley. So that was actually my first involvement in the nonprofit sector, was working with the homeless for the Berkeley Emergency Food Project.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Because I thought this was a recent problem, this homeless thing.
I know. It appears.
So it's been going on since the 80s? That's mind blowing.
All right.
That's interesting. So you kind of have seen it full arc. Do you think, are there differences today compared to what you were seeing in the 80s as a student?
I don't think I saw it with the sophistication that I see it now, just because I was dumb and young.
Right.
I think I had a simplistic view of what it was then. I thought, hey, if I help them write a resume, give them a little, few, cheers and encouragement, they'll get their life together. Clearly, it did not take me long to realize that I was grossly underestimating the challenges before them and how, in fact, naive I was.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in this episode. So what, you went to Berkeley, obviously. What was your focus there?
Actually, it was religious studies.
Okay.
So it was my lens of looking at human beings.
Theology in general?
No, not theology, really more religious pluralism. I looked at what religion looks like in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we have sort of a unique ability to birth new religions, unlike a lot of places. And so I looked at a lot of new religious experiences, was sort of my focus.
Yeah.
And then I did go on later to get my master's in nonprofit administration, which is technically what allegedly equips me for this work.
Well, when did you get to Chico? It sounds like we were talking before, and it sounds like you lived in the Bay, like I did for a bit.
So there, my husband and I married very young while I was still a student at Berkeley, and then we did coast to coast jumping. We went to Princeton, and then came back to the Bay and lived in Oakland, and then we moved from Oakland to New York City. And I did work again with the homeless there. I worked with the Bowery Mission, which is the oldest rescue mission in the country. And then we moved here 17 years ago.
Okay. Well, welcome.
Thanks.
I think everybody's not from here originally at some point.
No.
There's a lot of transplants.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've kind of, since you were 18, pretty much, since you were in college, this aspect of our society's kind of been front and center for you, right?
Yes.
What decided to kind of get you into it, basically up to your elbows, I would say?
Yeah. So actually, when we moved to Chico, I worked for the Jesus Center for 3 years. I had an employment blip and I knew the director was brand new in nonprofit work. And so I went and knocked on his door. I said, hey, how about hiring me to work with you on fundraising? And I became the assistant director at the Jesus Center, like 2004 through 2006. Okay. And then, just was a regular volunteer donor. I was building my own consulting business, and so I kept ties with the Jesus Center, a lot of friends on the board. And one day, one of the board members came to me and said we're having a leadership change, and would I consider being their next executive director? And as crazy, it took me a while to get off the floor because I'd never even actually thought of such a thing. And then literally within 48 hours, I'd shuttered my business and was making the transition to become a director.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about the Jesus Center. First of all, when was it founded?
We're just about to come into our 40th year. So.
And then has the location always been the same?
No, we've been in that location since the late 90s, but we were elsewhere on Park Avenue before. We were victim of 2 arsons, and then bought this building, which was called the Ice House at the time. It was historically, really, truly a building that was refrigerating stuff.
So the arson was this like
arson?
Full. Okay, just wasn't a.
You'll have to interview Katie Toma, my predecessor from that era. She's
times.
Now the chair of the chamber, or the head of the chamber.
Well, what? Okay, so what's the charter like back then versus today?
Yeah, so it's really simple. It's just to care for those folks who are the down and out in our community. It actually, interestingly, given the name, which is actually technically Jesus Provides Our Daily Bread, and it's actually not set up as a religious nonprofit.
I was going to ask, do I have to,
No, you have to do
basically
nothing.
Convert or anything like that?
Nothing. So we're just a, straight up 501c3. We're not a church, but our founders believed that the primary motivator for our work with the poor was because each and every person is beloved by God.
Okay. Has a mission changed since
No, I think our motivation, so our why, if you will, is just absolutely straight on to where it was. Our motivation is the same. The reason we do it, the reason we think others should do it is the same, and that's because of God's love. I think what we do will continue to evolve as we understand the complexity of homelessness.
Do you guys, is it true to say that you guys deal mostly with single women with kids?
No.
No.
So our day programs are anyone comes, anyone can come. They've always been sort of the in vogue name now is low barrier. We've always been low barrier.
Okay.
And so you can come as you are, to have meals twice a day, to have a shower, to come to our resource center, to come to the free store. So those programs have always been low barrier, open to anybody. Probably about 13 years ago, we started our shelter for women and children. And again, I think really the motivation being a biblical mandate is to care for those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so women on
Same
the street.
facility?
It's actually in our facility on Park Avenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was talking to Joy, and it sounds like they do somewhat of a segregation in terms of, if there's families, women
Right.
with families versus, because I can see kind of like some risk associated with having a low barrier shelter plus having
So we don't shelter men.
children. Okay.
We don't shelter men, and we don't have a low barrier shelter. So our day services don't include shelter.
Okay.
So the only sheltering we do is a sober facility, and it's women and children.
Okay.
Today.
Okay, got you. And so has that changed then?
No, that's been consistent
Okay.
since we opened Sabbath House, our shelter, and then probably 5 years ago, I think I've got the timing right. House of Hope was our first house to open, and really became a model of transitional housing. Studied with our director of services to figure out how to do their now 30-something houses, which is fantastic.
Let's talk a little bit about
Yeah.
transitional housing, because we haven't so far in this particular season dealing with this topic. We've touched on it, but we haven't really got into the details of it. What specifically about transitional housing? Where does it fit into the tool set, I guess?
No, it's a good question, and it's honestly gone out of vogue with the federal government. So those of us who still do it for particular reasons. And in our case, what we have seen from the shelter environment is that the stabilization process. So you have emergency, get them off the street, get them in a bed, get them safe, help
just
them
the
with
low level hierarchy
really,
of needs stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where the transitional piece is further stabilization before you start thinking long term. And what happens when you're in a survival mode, for a lot of people anyway, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's pretty typical, is your view of time shrinks. So you're thinking, where am I going to sleep tonight? Where am I going to eat today? And how am I going to keep my stuff safe and my body safe, right?
Yeah, and I get that. Like if I'm, I fly fish a lot, and my comprehension and of time passing by gets really compressed because, time's kind of irrelevant because I'm in the moment.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that that group of people are living really in the moment and not really strategic thinking, because when you think strategically, your temporal awareness changes based on, you need to cognitively, if you're thinking about what to do tomorrow, you're thinking more strategically now,
right.
And your time the dilation of time opens up again. So
right. And
I kind of understand.
Yeah, and I've done some study around poverty, just sort of generally, and they say that your time frame is always shorter when you're in deep poverty versus those of us who have more resources. It literally matches up.
Yeah.
With the fact that we can have a 5-year plan is a silly notion for someone who's trying to figure out how they're going to make it through the end of the day. Whereas we're like always talking about our 5-year plan or whatever. So I think that it's part of the restrictions, if you will, of having a lot of deficits that you face. Yeah,
and that that's an aspect of the psychology that we haven't really talked about a ton yet. We did touch on it with Joy. I can't remember if I talked to her specifically on the show about it or if it was after, but we did talk about it a little bit in that the state of mind that a homeless person's in at the time that they're in it is way different than how your average Joe that's, has a steady job is thinking about things.
Right.
Okay.
So I think it really does actually, what we've decided to do in terms of our program mix really has a lot to do with that. And what Shelley Watson, our Director of Services, has experienced and studied and tested is that although the in vogue program intervention is housing first, and we really believe in sheltering, so you get them out of the elements 100%. But in terms of permanent housing, some just will not thrive if they're not given some opportunity to build their capacity. And so what transitional housing does, so you take it from a shelter where they do nothing. They show up, they get to eat, they're told where to shower, put their stuff. I mean, it's a real simple experience. When you move them into transitional, they have an income. They're paying in part for that program. They have a bed. They have a key. They have independence. There's not a house mama, making sure they make their bed. Sure, there are checks and those kinds of things, but you're more independent, a lot more independent. And what we've learned in that environment is the folks who are involved in those programs say it'll sometimes take them a full year to get their physical rhythms into a place where they wake up on the right time, go to sleep at the right time, sleep through the night. I mean, their bodies have so adapted to that survival mode, particularly if they've had any drug issues or mental health issues that were left untreated. They just and yet there's a backstop to that. So if they don't pay their rent, we don't kick them out. We have a conversation. We work with them. They're their case manager. If they really aren't thriving, we'll bring them back into the shelter. So there's support system around it. And
I assume that everybody's kind of got a different amount of time runway that they need to achieve that, right?
Yeah. I mean, we have generally said up to 2 years, but because we're privately funded, nobody holds our hand to that.
Right.
And now with the housing crisis, we're leaving more leeway. But we actually had 4 people move out to permanent housing in the last week. So we're very excited about that.
And then for that transitional housing, how much capacity do you guys have?
Yeah. So now we have 6 houses.
And then how many
we're 40-ish. It depends on the number of children.
Number of heads basically is what you're talking about. Okay. Yeah. So there's roughly 10 families?
They're not 15? All families. So we have 1 house for women and children.
Okay.
And we work really closely with the county on that house. It's a lot of women who are trying to regain their custody of their children. So again, the county really appreciates the kind of supervision and stabilization we give them, because that gives them more confidence that bringing the children back into the household it's a good idea. So that's 1 house. We have another house that was given to us actually by some members of a Catholic parish that were really pro-life, and they wanted us to go in together on a house for pregnant mothers and newborns and little ones. So that house has women and children. And then we have 2 houses for women, but sometimes like this last week, we put in 2 families into one of those houses. And then we have a men's house, and then we have an elderly women's house. So they kind of each have their own little culture and character, and they've been very successful for us.
And are they all in the same geographic area? Are they spread?
Nope, they're scattered.
Okay.
Which is also part by design.
Okay. What's the rationale?
Yeah, the rationale is get them into neighborhoods, get them stabilized.
Integrated more.
Yep.
Okay.
We really don't want them coming back to the Jesus Center.
Right.
A lot of breaking social habits, obviously addiction habits, is getting folks engaged in a different community, whether that's through a faith community, their neighborhood, other support systems.
And it may also, if you break up the cohort, like the people that they typically hang around with,
yes,
that
absolutely.
may have, destructive habits.
Yep. And that's true. Again, housed or unhoused, it's just pretty basic.
Yeah. Okay. What are some of the biggest misconceptions the public has about your org?
About the Jesus Center?
Yeah.
I think right now,
I know one of mine was religion. I thought you guys, it was, I thought that you got there and you had to be converted or something in order to.
Well, in your
enjoy the
case, it
services.
might be actually the case. It's a case by case case.
You barely
we do
know
an
me.
assessment.
And you know me so well.
I don't know. I can read it in your face. No, it's never been that. And there are models of faith-based organizations where they're you kind of have to listen to a sermon before you get fed.
Right.
That's never been our model. And obviously, each director has had a little bit of a different bent in terms of that. I have definitely supported, and my board has surrounded me with a much broader umbrella. So we don't have one version even of Christianity representative. We do offer Bible studies. They're completely voluntary, and we have 5 different teachers who. If you like one, you probably don't like the other. Like they really are different theologically and in approach. So it's an offering. We believe in the saving power of God for someone's life. And we would feel like we would be remiss if we didn't offer a spiritual transformation alongside all the physical and other components, but we don't. It's an offer.
But I could be a Muslim mother and come in there and you guys would.
I have a Muslim staff. Yes, you could be a Muslim mother.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. No, we make no distinction on race.
Okay.
Gender, anything.
So there's the PIT surveys come up as kind of like the source of truth for data and dealing, trying to quantify homelessness in terms of what it is today, whether it's trending up or down, this and that. It seems to be the standard of measure. I was told that Jesus Center hired outside consultants to study homelessness in Butte County. Why was it done? Was there something about the PIT survey that would kind of left a bad taste in your guys' mouth? I just want to understand a little bit.
No, it was when we did bring in an outside consultant. This was over almost 3 years ago now. Yeah. It was to augment that data.
There was certain holes in it that you guys needed to fill. Okay.
And so that there's no one data source, unfortunately, that can give us the complexity we need. We have also since voluntarily joined the county's homeless management information system and developed
HMIS.
Yes, yeah. And we also, in the midst of that, developed a what's been called the service card, and it's an intake for everyone who comes to the Jesus Center, and it's now being spread countywide, which we're super excited about.
This is good. So basically, with that, the implication is that if everybody's doing intake the same way, that person's being described the same way across all the organizations.
That's the idea.
If they bounce from one service to the other, the record is still accurate and can be updated.
Right. So once you enter into the HMIS system, you do share your social and your birth date. So we do have distinguishing, even if they decide not to use the same name, we have distinguishing
the unique
data.
ID is on social. Yeah.
And the service card is great for the end user, for the client, because then they don't have to go through that intake every time. They can scan in to anyone who's cooperating with that system, and that data will roll out. Now, what I will say, we're still in the process. Keep in mind that the HMIS system was a mandated database by the federal government.
Yeah, through HUD. And it was my understanding was that if it wasn't used, then if you were trying to get federal funds, you wouldn't even be.
No, you can't.
You wouldn't even be open to do it.
Right. And so we entered in voluntarily because we had never in the history of our organization ever done an official intake for everyone who came in for day services. We always did for our housing shelter programs, but not for our day programs. And so I could tell you how many trays were taken. That was the level of the data I had even a year ago. So now I can tell you their age range. I can tell you their gender.
Yeah.
I can tell you all sorts of basic demographic information just so that we can understand better who it is we're serving, how often they come. Should we be augmenting our services if 60% are over 55? That means I have a different demographic than 65% are under 40.
Absolutely.
Right?
It'll help you basically optimize your service offering.
Exactly.
Right?
So that's why we were motivated. And then those who receive government grants, we don't. They have to do it. But we also felt like the more of us in it means more real-time data.
Absolutely.
The problem with the pit, and it has its limitations and it has its advantages, but the problem with it is it's once every 2 years.
Yeah.
And we wanted to know today, and if, who's using services and how do they describe themselves? And again, we're still in process in that full integration, but we are all committed to having a shared release of information.
Everybody said
getting
that
on the
show.
same system. Yeah. 100%. Everyone will win.
And this is uber important for the listener. This piece, this will help. As I've said many times, I probably sound like a broken record now, but this gets down to the heart of case management. And if we're trying to, deal with someone that is, inherently transient and they're popping around from service to service, we need somebody to track that person so we can kind of shepherd them through this system.
Well,
it's encouraging to hear.
Particularly our participants in housing, they can have 3 and 4 case managers in the system. And that's in part by design, because they'll have someone at behavioral health. They'll have someone with Department of Social Services working with their children. If they're on probation, they've got probation. We don't need to add more tasks and objectives. We need to support the ones that are already there. And so we're really committed to doing anything we can to streamline that kind of work. And in that sense, in some ways, our programming for our housing participants is pretty low. Yeah.
And I think, over time, what I would expect to happen naturally is each entity, whether it be Safe Space or Torres or you guys, you'll kind of optimize and specialize in an aspect of the service spectrum.
Yes, absolutely.
And hopefully, and it becomes more of a pipeline, if you will, that you can use this case management system to, push them through the right shunts and pipes to get them out the other side and productive again.
Yeah. And right now you see it, if you will, a little bit more haphazardly, but if someone tells you their testimony, if you will, they have touches from multiple agencies. Yeah. It's
probably kind of, a little overwhelming for them.
But it also gives some opportunities because, again, you had the bias, if you have to go to the Jesus Center, well, obviously with a name that's so faith forward, some people never come in thinking those things too, whatever they've made up. They don't know who we are. They don't know how we do what we do.
Have you guys talked about rebranding?
Yes, we have.
Is it still on the table or no?
No.
Okay. Just curious. I do branding, so just wondering. Not for myself, but I just, if you guys are trying to, not be so faith forward, that might be something to consider.
What I would rather do, and what I've settled with, and I think we've done it in community with those who support us, is I'd rather redefine who Jesus is by having that in our names. I think sometimes Jesus gets a bad rap because of people who follow after him. And I'd rather be a surprisingly bright light in that than ditch him.
Right. That makes sense. So with the main facility plus the homes, what's your capacity?
So in housing, if you will, we're about 65.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it like 80-20, 80 cots and then 20% houses, or
23 beds in the shelter and the rest are in the houses?
Oh, okay. I thought it's the exact opposite of what I thought. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we talked about the data collection, and did the pit surveys help you guys drive any operational decisions, or was it really when you guys went out and did your own kind of investigations?
I think our own data has been more helpful, but the 17 pit was particularly powerful. I think I was involved in the methodology and in the planning, and it was a very thorough study. And I'm still digesting the data that we've gotten in 2019. Yeah. It was taken in March, not in January. So now we have an anomalous date. And we did count campfire survivors. And like everything else in this community, I'm not sure it gives us a clear picture of what we're really dealing with. I don't have an alternative reality to tell you about, but I'd like to digest it more.
Okay. There's been talk of like accountability. So, someone comes into the system and say they either fall out of the system or they come out of the system, they cause problems. Is there any way, and I guess this is probably the low barrier people that aren't into the low barrier, the idea of a low barrier. How do you guys deal with accountability and then, general public safety?
Right. So I mentioned that our dining room and all our day services are low barrier and always have been. One of the reasons we push forward on the data was so we could move further away from anonymous engagement and further into a more relational approach. In other words, we use an attractive model. So we use food, to be honest, to attract people to the facilities so that we can build relationships with them. It's pretty simple.
Makes sense.
Food alone does not fix their lives. It's a good unto itself, and it's a means to this further, more engagement. And the rules so now it's very explicit. We've always had guidelines for behaviors, but now when they have that one-on-one meeting, when they come in for that service card, they actually are shown a list of expectations of behavior, and they actually have to initial those things. And then there's also a set of expectations that they can ask from us, that they be treated with dignity, that they get a fair hearing if they feel like they were wrongly accused of something, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So there's a mutual agreement. And it basically just says, hey, if you want to come here, this is how we play.
Yeah.
Now, 98% of the people who come in for an intake will sign that. We actually, as a staff, wear that list on our name tags. So if anyone might forget in real time, we can remind them of what they signed. This is sort of an abbreviated version of it on our name tags. But that is what we speak to. You chose into this.
Yeah. And
we want you to stay here. And and then we have essentially a warning system, a verbal, a 1 day out, a 3 day out, and then a 30-day out. And then there are people that are not welcome. And usually that's the more egregious behaviors, violence, ongoing threats and intimidation to staff or to other participants. Those are the ones.
Yeah. And we, I plan to talk to Commander Aldrich about that contingent, I guess, of the population. Because I feel like that's where the problem is, especially with the quality of life impact of the community. I've used the word feral before on this particular show, and I think a lot of people bristle at that, but I see a lot of parallels. Like when you're talking about when someone first comes off the street and they've had no social integration, that they're very much in the moment. They don't have any kind of like long-term planning capabilities really. I like that word because there's people that, that if they adopt a pet, right? And that pet's really skittish when they first come home and it's hiding under the bed. And then slowly over time, you get the dog, you get the animal on some sort of a process where it's eating 2-3 times a day at certain times. And there's a regimented schedule. And over time, the pet starts to actually become a integrated member of the house, right? And I see a lot of parallels there. I know it sounds weird to compare humans to
we try not
animals
to do
in that way, but the reason I'm doing it is because there's people may not have any context on the human side of what that emotional state is like for a human,
right? But
they can definitely draw a comparison when they've rescued an animal, because I see a lot of parallels there. So I'm just trying to make that analogy to kind of build a little empathy on that side. I know it sounds kind of weird to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might use some other kinds of ways of describing it. I think, the way we describe people's characteristics, if you will, who find themselves homeless, it's really varied. But I talk about the internal issues and the external. The easy ones to talk about are the external. Right. I lost my health care. I mean, I just hired a woman whose dad had a health emergency. They went bankrupt. The dad died. They ended up living at the Jesus Center and taking services by the Jesus Center. So those are circumstantial things. Like they were already maybe a little tenuous. Mom can't work because she's on disability.
Yeah.
Dad goes, and all of a sudden, shoot, what just happened, right?
Well, I think that's indicative of a lot of people that live in this country. They just
all the time this is happening. It's I mean, it's the number.
There's a lot of people on the edge, and it's getting worse.
The number one reason for bankruptcy is health emergencies.
Yeah.
So these are circumstantial things that could hit any of us. Loss of job, change of family. We saw this in the pit. Family emergency, health, loss of housing. We're seeing that right now where people are losing their leases and they can't afford to re-up because the prices are all out of their range, and a loss of job or a spousal loss of job. What we might call a family emergency of some sort. So those are all external, if you will. They happen, they're circumstantial. The internal bundle to me is really, and what I would say is those folks are relatively easy to restabilize. And we might say they're greens and yellows in terms of they can come into a place like the Jesus Center and say, I need X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
But they already have their
These
ID.
are not systemic problems.
No, they already have their ID. They have been employed. They have been housed. They probably have some support network.
Yeah.
Maybe they, and those are things, those are advantages that make helping them and giving them, a little hand here or there much easier. We can give them $1,000 and they can get that first, the rent deposit in, but that's all they need. Right. So it's simplistic, if you will. As you go down in complexity, maybe in the orange zone, if you want to call it that, then you really start seeing a lot of the internal complexity. And that's
drug addiction. Things
yeah.
like
So
that.
for me, it's adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. That's childhood trauma, mental illness, and addiction.
Is it in that order of hierarchy?
Well, no, because that is a cluster, if you will.
Okay.
It's a cluster.
If you were going to rank them by frequency, how would you do it?
It's a cluster. They come together typically.
Okay.
So one will beget the other, and it's not always, one is not always the chicken and one is not always the egg. So for example, we have a staff member who was an addict at 7. He grew up unhoused. He was an addict at 7.
Holy shit.
He used until he was 32. He's been sober 3 years. You don't become an addict at 7 because you're a bad, lazy person.
Somebody's giving it to you.
Someone gave it to him. He wasn't housed. He watched everyone around him use.
That's normal.
So by the time he was 7, there's 10 indicators on the ACEs scale. 10, just 10. And he probably hit 6 or 7. Once you hit 4, you exponentially increase your risk for a whole slew of physical ailments. Your life expectancy drops by 30%. And mental health gets, severely compromised, addiction, all those things. You become higher risk for all of those. Heart, everything. Is ACEs a acronym, I assume? Mm-hmm. Adverse childhood experiences.
Okay, you said it earlier.
It was a study that was done, I think it was 1987, the original study through Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. And our new, is it Surgeon? No, it's not Surgeon General. Is it Surgeon General at the state level? Anyway, our number one health officer of the state of California is an expert in ACEs.
But it's basically a risk assessment model.
It's a risk assessment model.
Okay.
But it's brilliant, and it has changed the course of trauma-informed education, physical care, homelessness, everything. It's changed everything in terms of how we see somebody. And so when you hear someone talk about trauma-informed, it usually goes back to the original ACEs work and continue work. And now, since that study, they have actually drawn correlatives between those experiences. So parent is incarcerated, parent uses drugs, divorce is one of them. So there's like 3 emotional, 3 physical, and 3 something else. And they've actually correlated that with brain development. So they've actually studied children under these adverse childhood experiences and what's going on with their brain development over a longitudinal study. So it's pretty ridiculously great stuff in terms of obviously preventative work at some point, and actually now they're starting to do diagnostic work. So it's a little controversial because of course you're going to do that probably in a school setting where you're going to test for ACEs. Well, when you test for ACEs, you're also testing the parents, right? because they're usually the ones that are going to be the authors of some part of of those exposures. So it's tricky, but it could change the game completely in terms of interventions.
Yeah,
so
that's cool.
The folks that we work with, who are primarily adults, 99% of them are adults, we get them after those ACEs have already been experienced. So if they are already in that 4 range, their whole brain chemistry has changed, their likelihood of addiction, and then recovery becomes very difficult. Obviously, their families often are broken and messed up.
Well,
so the trauma piece is huge.
And that begs a question then. So if you've got, let's say, an individual that's got a couple kids coming into the organization, do the kids undergo an ACEs test?
No one's doing a diagnostic yet. Okay. They're just beginning that work. Because
growing up with an alcoholic that's somewhat cyclical, like his dad was, and probably his dad's dad. So okay.
So, but we know that the children who come into our programming are it is so important for us to surround them with supportive services. And fortunately, in our county, we have a lot that are designed right for kids. But just even homelessness actually is not one of the ACEs. And so we know that obviously being homeless suggests a lot of the other indicators, but it is actually not an indicator under itself in the official 10. But we know that it is. I mean, it's certainly.
I want to look back to the HMIS data for a second. As I prepared for these interviews, the common theme was one of mistrust due to lack of transparency or perceived lack of transparency. What I'm encouraged, what all three of you guys have said is like this HMIS data is going to give us a very, the best view that we've had up until this point in time.
Right.
I know that there's privacy, obviously, that you guys need to worry about, but are there plans to share kind of like aggregate, information with the general public to kind of know which way the needle's moving?
Part of I don't know officially whether there's plans for release of.
Let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
Does the HMIS system have reporting capabilities for the purposes of informing the general tax-paying public that is funding it? Do you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the reports are robust. I could pull you, and I'm happy to send you our most recent, just basic, everything we know demographically about our participants. I can send you that today.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I mean, again, does it tell you everything? No. Because we're not asking everything.
But it would be better than what's being shared right now. I mean, it seems like the only data, unless in an ideal world, someone shouldn't have to call you guys for the information. It should just be posted somewhere. And when I say you guys, I mean all the service providers, right?
No.
And I know that's indicative of a lack of infrastructure. Especially technical infrastructure, but it sounds like that's being solved slowly. So,
part of what my dilemma, and I was just working with a Chico State grad, Paul Lambros. He's up in Seattle, and he runs an organization called Plymouth Housing, about how do you manage data release. And up in Seattle, there was this viral video called "Seattle is Dying."
Yeah, I've seen it.
And I asked him about it. I said, "What do you think?" And he had one word: propaganda. He's in permanent supportive housing. They do fantastic work moving people out of homelessness. He says, just propaganda. I said, okay, so tell me, because that propaganda has come down here too. And I need to, give me some tips. You've been at this way longer than I have. And, basically counter bad data with good data, right? So part of my concern about releasing things without a narrative, and you've probably already figured this out, I like to talk. So something that just stays static on a piece of paper or on a computer screen lacks nuance. When I describe and that doesn't mean I can't do it, but it's part of I can't speak for the other providers, and I'm not required to give out HMIS data because it doesn't come, no one's paying me to do that, but I'd be happy to. And that was one of the reasons why I did it, was so that we could. But it's also, it's funny, this PITS survey, I've had a couple of conversations where people were like, it's grossly undercounted, therefore it's invalid. And then the same people said in 17, these numbers obviously were trumped. It's like, okay, so naysayers, you don't like the data we give you. And if it's high, you say it's rigged. And if it's low, you've now called it rigged. So part of what I'm trying to figure out is and I was just working with a professor over at Chico State, Susan Roll, who's the chair of the social work department about this. I said, if you could help us get data that others would respect as reliable, you would solve one of my biggest problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, data for looking at data, because I did a lot of it when I was product managing at eBay.
Yeah.
We dealt with, millions of transactions a day. And as a product manager, you just get a litany of reports. Those reports, at face value, if they're not put into context, can be, basically interpreted a lot of different ways.
Totally. It's
And
like any statistic, right?
so I think that,
I need help on
one, like, I think you guys need to all agree on what the reports are going to be, and because there's a term in my world called garbage in, garbage out.
Totally.
So if you guys are all, some of you are filling out certain pieces and others aren't, then the reports are going to be shoddy and unreliable. So I think that first of all is like standardize how you're gonna quantify the service.
Yeah.
And then agree on it. And then come up with a workflow that's going to work for everybody. And then on the reporting side, just be transparent about it, get it out in the public, take the opportunities, to contextualize it as best you can, but knowing that it will not likely, but it could be weaponized.
Yeah.
But, one of the purposes of this show is to, give people an unedited, format to kind of do what we're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and this is an area, communications in general about this topic is just an ongoing challenge to figure out what we've taken a kind of a high-end educational approach in all of our work is just try to help people understand the complexity of homelessness so that we may not be able to give you the solution, the perfect solution, but if we can't come up with the right solutions if we don't identify the problem appropriately. So that's,
and also work as a community together.
Yeah.
It's a bipartisan issue.
This is everybody's challenge, and it's it's not,
and it's a different problem than a city's normally deals with, right? It doesn't have a beginning and an end.
Nope.
There is no end because we're human beings, and there's always a certain contingent in the population that's going to need a hand. Not everybody can, keep a job or has a mental capacity to do so.
Right.
So there's got to be some infrastructure in place. You can't light the places on fire. You can't lock them in jail for simply being homeless. So there's got to be some infrastructure in place. That being said, I want to wrap this up with this. There's a certain percentage of the homeless population that is causing, based on what the research I've done, the people I've talked to, they're causing the majority of the problems,
right?
And quality of life, crime problems. And I think it's casting a shadow on all the good work that's being done. So how do you suggest, how can we as a community all come together and figure out how to deal with that component? Because that's where all this angst is coming from.
Well, I think what I've really come to the conclusion, particularly this year in light of some of the projects we've been trying to work on, is that there's no one group in this community that's responsible for everyone in this bucket, if you will. So when, it's not the Jesus Center and the Torah Shelter's responsibility to respond to everyone who's without a home. It's just asking too much. And so when you look at the spectrum of need, we're going to do what we're best at doing. Torah Shelter is going to do what they're best at doing. Safe Space is going to do what they're best at doing. And I will tell you, none of us are equipped to deal with criminals or the cyclical drug behaviors that drives criminality.
Yeah.
Some do some of that. Some of us do some of that. And I'll tell you, I was with a drug addict today and trying to, just treat him as a human being and help him. But I'll tell you, we are going to be developing more in drug addiction services in our new facility, but we don't have that ability right now. So particularly when it comes to criminality, whether you're housed or unhoused, if you're breaking the laws of our community, that is a law enforcement and court problem. Yeah. And it is not our responsibility, except to the extent that we've caused it, which I will not take responsibility for that.
Yeah. And
we keep people out of criminality by saving them before they get in that system. And those who are there and stuck, then we have to take a different approach.
Yeah. And I mean, the tools that are available, that used to be available, they were federal hospitals. You could those folks could be shunted into, but they're, they were pulled off.
Yeah. Those who are mentally ill and untreated we have very, very few resources for them as a country.
And that's something that needs to be solved, I think, at the federal level, at the community level, with this other contingent you're talking about, whether it's drug or just violent crime type folks. The obvious answer to me is jail situation, right? Incarceration, and then, forced rehabilitation of some sort.
Yeah, some diversion program. I think those diversion programs, what I've read, are fantastic.
Yeah. And I've been told that there's just there's a lack of resources on, from a capacity perspective on the jails. The DA isn't pushing those cases too hard because of this reason, the root of it. So this is something, I've been kind of chewing on in my mind, is like, do we need more jails? Is that the answer to deal with this? And it kind of seems like it might be. I'm going to be talking to Commander Aldridge here pretty soon on the next episode, actually, and we'll unbox that question a lot more, because I don't know the answer quite yet, but we will in the next episode. Before we go, I wanted to talk a bit about, just touch on the Orange Street project. I know it's been like 6 weeks since all the hubbub happened, but want to talk about the Orange Street project, why you guys pulled out, and then talk about the Renewal Center, because they're obviously related, right?
Yeah, so we've been, let me just talk about the Renewal Center first, because we've been working on it for 2 years, 2.5 really. We've been looking to move, and 2 years ago, this month, the city of Chico offered to sell us the property adjacent to the tourist shelter, the 4 acres. And in November, we entered escrow on that property, and we have worked very, very hard to build a multiple layered collaboration. We have all the county offices. We have 16 different entities who have said they want to work with us on this. We now have a new housing provider out of Irvine who's going to build permanent supportive housing and help us with the final plan for that. We're going to be selling our Park Avenue property to them, and they're going to build permanent supportive housing or affordable housing there. So we have taken huge steps forward on that project. And what happened after the fire, as you well know, all sorts of resources appeared in the community literally overnight to address the problems that were emerging post-fire. And one of those was the Walmart Foundation. And they approached me to find out more about what was going on with homelessness prior to the fire. We had lengthy conversations, and somehow, in some weird, miraculous way, at one point they asked me, well, what is needed in Chico just for, again, forget fire, prior to the fire, what's needed? And right after the fire, we had met Safe Space, Chat, and Tourist Shelter and I, and talked about what is it that's really, what are we looking at? And we all agreed we need a permanent location for the low barrier shelter. And so when they asked that question, I said, that's what we need. And so that's where that originated. And then we spent 4 months searching for the right property, which we should have known better because we knew how hard a property was to find, because we had looked for almost a year before the city offered us that piece of land. So,
and we're talking the Orange Street
location. The Orange Street location. Yeah. And we built the rapport with the landlord. That took at least 6 weeks. We tried, we worked with the council, we worked with the city manager, and when we actually brought it to city council, we had, at their request, they wanted to know before anyone else, we hadn't done enough work around the edges. We hadn't talked to the school district. We had only preliminary meetings with the university. And so everyone went into
it seemed
squirrely mode.
It seemed like after the president of Chico State went on record not supporting it, it seems like the oxygen just kind of disappeared. That was a huge blow. And I said immediately to Safe Space, as a representative of the Jesus Center, I said, this is going to be very difficult for us to go against the university. And I've been obviously criticized for that. The DCBA went on to say, no, thank you. The school district was really pushing back. And we rely on 100% on community support. And we have had a huge investment in the Renewal Center. And we had to make the calculation, do we keep pushing? And we pretty much could have
we were sure that there'd be a lawsuit against us.
Yeah.
We had threats.
And it's also,
So-
it was always intended to be a
And
temporary
it was
shelter
already,
anyway.
yeah,
so
exactly. It was a
strategically
bridge.
yeah.
It was meant to be a bridge to the renewal center. We felt like, gosh, this is great. We can get an early win. The community is exhausted with the problem. This is a great way to address it. The building was perfect. And we just, again, we just had to make a strategic, long-term decision. And we feel like we made the right decision. It was never intended to kill the project. That was never our intention. Safe Space very valiantly decided they wanted to go on without us, and we supported them. Angela is my witness. But Walmart had the same response. They didn't want to do something. Obviously, they're completely brand conscious.
Oh, yeah, it's a PR nightmare for them.
Yeah, they didn't want to do something that the community was up in arms about either. So I was never part of those inner conversations, but I could only imagine what they were. So
I'd have loved to have been, but no.
yeah, so we refocused, and to be honest, we also, in our staff and our board, we were hit hard by the fire. So we had a very weary team, and at some point, there was no money being transacted for that project, and my staff was exhausted. So
what, fast forward to today with respect to this the renewal center. I don't know much about it. Is it built? Is it
No.
in construction?
No.
Has ground been broken?
Nope.
Okay.
So
location picked?
Yeah, the location's picked.
Okay.
We're in escrow. So that's exciting.
Where's the location?
It's next to the tourist shelter.
Okay.
By the Silver Dollar Fairgrounds.
Sort of by Walmart. Well, right by Walmart.
Yeah.
Adjacent,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, not. Yeah.
Okay, capacity wise, what are we looking
So
at?
we're just doing the final version of the plan, but a quick and dirty is the Jesus Center building will have twice as many shelter beds for singles and a family floor for up to 15 families. Again, this is just today's version. So that'll look like something like 80 beds.
Cool.
And those will be sober. And then the second building will be the multi-use service center, which is where everyone will come and join us and offer services in location. We'll also have a mobile medical unit on site. And then the second floor of that building will be specialized population sheltering. So there'll be medical respite beds. There'll be maybe probation beds, maybe veteran beds. Those folks who don't thrive in a mass, multi-population situation. So it'll be an open shelter, but it'll have that kind of hosted feeling. So different groups will be working with us on that.
Gotcha.
And then there'll be a full building of permanent housing.
Okay, cool. Anything else any questions that I didn't ask that you would like to get out there to the public?
Did I adequately address the data thing? It's a
think
little
so.
bit of a conundrum for me too. It's not that we're totally open to it, but we just
it's
more the
key,
how, not
the thing I want to leave you with is that I got a lot of insight from the community that there needs to be more transparency. It just needs to be
I think you didn't ask the question, but I think
I'm hoping that in this series of episodes, it kind of those folks that are wondering, that had that question in their mind, maybe it's a little bit more clear on what that is and or isn't.
Yeah.
With respect to the data, though, like getting back to this idea of transparency. I mean, it's just up until this point, my takeaway is that there hasn't been a whole lot of data shared other than the pit surveys. That my hope is that if you guys can come together, form like a coalition on a report.
We have it.
And we
have it.
Yeah.
They meet every month.
So thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Chad.
Laura, where can people find you guys on social media?
Yeah, we are on Facebook, and I think we do a little on Twitter, but we have a new staff member, so you might see more of us on Twitter too.
Cool.
But Facebook, just the Jesus Center, or we have two really fun Facebook pages that give you a window into our vocational training. We have a Blooming Hope Facebook page, which is our flower business, where we engage with our participants in all aspects of the flower business.
Cool.
And then we also have a farm, a sustainable farm, where you can actually join and be a CSA member and get a farm share. That farm gives opportunities to participants to learn all about sustainable farming, get some soft skills, and many have gone on to getting jobs and certainly finding peace, because that dirt is holy.
Very cool.
And then, of course, we have a
Instagram?
website.
Yeah.
Oh,
What's your
we
web
don't do Instagram.
address?
Web address is jesuscenter.org.
Okay. No Insta?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah.
Glad we finally got
I
to
know.
connect. If you guys, if you like this episode, please rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
This podcast has been brought to you by AMP.build, a software and digital design agency located in Chico, California. Learn more at www.amp.build. If you have ideas or questions for the show, send an email to hello@amp.build. We may air it on the next show.